You're listening to Two Beers Until Phronesis, a philosophy podcast for students, graduates, and anyone else interested in ideas. Alongside regular guests and friends, we discuss some of life's big questions over a few beers. Enjoy.
Should we just sit here in silence and put it out as a podcast?
Experimental, cutting edge shit, that is. No, I don't know. I kind of wanted to talk about, like, our idea of philosophy individually. Because it's interesting because you never studied it, and I've obviously studied it, started this podcast, because I studied it for 5 years.
Right.
And kind of had this really close relationship with it for about 5 years. Probably more like 7 years. Like, started at sixth form, and I was like, oh, this shit's really good. I've finally, like, turned on to something.
Well, you specialised, I guess, in, religion and ethics, as opposed to... I mean, did you do much in aesthetics or as much in, ontology, for example?
Well, we just touched on everything. It was way too broad, I think. Although I think that's kind of good. I do think you should, like, broadly learn a lot of things. Quite like the American model of learning, where they kind of major in things and they this more holistic. And I think it would be... I think that's actually the future of philosophy. I think philosophy as its own discipline is just dying a slow death in academia, wrapped up in... Because people have this conception of philosophy where it's just like, oh, we're just going to talk about Kant, we're going to talk about Nietzsche, we're going to talk about Plato. That's philosophy. And the kind of reader's guides and the introductions. And that was actually something I wanted to touch on today, was kind of the distinction between that and the distinction between a more broad idea of philosophy. Because I was talking the other day to Zach about how philosophy is intertwined intrinsically with the idea of sport. How it's... to compete with somebody is a form of self-examination.
Yeah, well, I mean, to a greater or lesser extent, it's entwined in everything.
Exactly. That's just one example, yeah. But I think if people had that idea of philosophy, then we probably wouldn't really need to talk about philosophy. Because I feel like there's always a context when we talk about philosophy. It's this context of, hey, philosophy isn't boring, guys. Let's try and make it more interesting. Or philosophy is this really coveted hard thing that you need to go read a lot of books and then you'll understand it. But yeah, so in one sense, I think that learning very broadly is good. But then, yeah, I think probably my course was a bit too broad. Because you never studied philosophy formally at all, did you?
No, not at all.
So how did you get into all those ideas and stuff?
Partly through you. I think I just got to a stage where I was becoming interested. I think it was... perhaps ethics. It must have been sort of through the ethics side where I think you hit a point where you're kind of like, oh, hang on a minute. Much of the sort of foundations of what I thought I understood about things and how I saw the world is actually not as grounded in reality as I thought it was. Or at least in the sense that I had beliefs or held beliefs about the world and about, the way that people interact with each other and, all these different things and aesthetics and, and knowledge that sort of turned out to have a lot of more caveats and be a lot more sort of debated and contested than I thought.
It sounds to me like when you're describing that you kind of woke up. It's like maybe you were not dogmatic before, but you didn't consider the complexity of everything, all the different ideas.
Right.
Which is, I think that was basically the same for me. Because I think everyone goes through this to some degree. Like when you're a teenager or whatever, you suddenly realize that adults are just kind of just as scared and like confused as you, and
well, just as naive about different things.
Yeah,
it's just the naivety sort of shifts into different areas.
Yeah, but it's like you kind of realize all the things you just take as read and as granted. You kind of realize, oh, well, these aren't as foundational as I thought. They're more subject to change, and really, I had no idea about that. Like, even just take it down to the most basic example I can think of is something like when we use the word good in a moral sense. It's like, well, what do we mean when we say that something's a good thing? I don't know. It really struck me actually when I realized that these were legit questions, and that I hadn't really thought about them before. Because I actually wanted to go study philosophy to like. I thought you couldn't do physics without doing metaphysics first. You couldn't do ethics without doing metaethics. So I was like, oh shit, we have to go away and answer all these fundamental questions. And you realize that, that's not really what metaethics and metaphysics does. That's more, they're describing things that already exist. It's like, you don't really come to to a different idea of ethics through meta-ethics. You just reacquaint yourself with what you already consider is moral and true and good, I think.
Right. Or you explore the foundations of certain areas of ethics. It's the parameterization of it, I guess, in a way. It's sort of like, okay, so what do we consider ethics? What is ethics? And organizing the different parts of, say, ethics. So we group them into different ideas. We group them into different fields of philosophies.
Because this is something we probably touched on in the long lost pilot episode that we put up, and I did that with the two Joes. And I remember you listened to it, and you said you slightly disagreed with our definition of philosophy. You thought it's this ordering of thought.
Right, because this is the problem with defining philosophy, is depending on who you ask, and it's funny because the people I think the more academic people who do more philosophy tend to define it much more broadly than I would say most people would think about it. You know, if you go on like Wikipedia for philosophy or something like that, it's going to say, well, philosophy is about asking fundamental questions about reality, about ethics, and it will, you know, go on to list the various branches of philosophy, and so it's asking these kinds of questions and about these fundamental and foundational questions. But you ask a lot of philosophers and they'd probably say, well, yeah, but it's also kind of like a way of life or a way of thought, or it's like perhaps they're trying to sort of overstretch it to the point where it's like, well, it's more than just asking questions, it's more than just thinking, you know, at which point I tend to go, well, if we want to try to make this a broader definition, I think the best you can do is probably go, well, if we're expanding it to just a formalized way of thinking, then the ordering of thoughts is probably the most broad without having to, you know, totally isolate anyone.
I think I agree with you, but then I think that ordering of thought has a social and historical context from which it came.
Right.
And I think that can't really be ignored. So I'd say that this inquiry into the nature of what it means to be human, when philosophy began, kind of started under certain conditions.
Right, but words change, and this is the problem, is what was considered philosophy back then is not, because we use the word now, over time, over hundreds of years, these words change, and what we best suit to fit them, what we're talking about,
much
more important than perhaps saying, well, philosophy as a sort of, you know, as this monolithic thing, as this concept has always been, you know, this, we have to have something that is all, you know, has this perennial definition that is consistent throughout every, you know, we don't have to have that. We just have to have a label that it works for our current language or understanding of the word. Yeah,
so I get that, but then I think that's very hard to do in a modern context, because I think that we live in an age where it's virtually impossible to start pinning things down, because there's such a multitude of different ways of approaching the subject. There's too much plurality in the way that people see something like philosophy. So that's why I kind of revert back to the historical definition, because I you know, something like feminism. It's like, well, how would you pin down what feminism is now? Like, who would you ask? Would you go to feminists? Well, who are the feminists? Like, and which branch of feminism are we talking? How are we going to conceptualize that? So I think it's much easier to go, well, let's look at Emily Pankhurst. Let's see, and then let's get an essence of feminism from that, and kind of maybe use that as an anchor to look at what's all the shout factory that's going on right now.
The problem with doing that is the feminism in the context of what you're talking about would be a historical form of it, and sort of movements, and certainly, you know, when the historical social context changes, so does the movement, and what it advocates for and how it changes with the environment makes it a different thing in a sense that we're using a label for. But obviously the meaning of the word is sort of changing as the movement does, in a way, like we were doing with the pre-Socratics episode when we were talking about the idea of, you know, physics, or the idea of you know, coming up with naturalistic explanations for the world. It's like the words philosophy and the words like, you know, science or whatever are words that don't necessarily really work the further back you get, because what we're doing is we're using them in a modern context. But this is the point. It's like we don't have to necessarily retroactively define a word. And if that means that, say, what people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were doing way back there wasn't quite the same as we would necessarily define philosophy today, for example. So, you know, philosophy now probably incorporates many different things. We have branches like analytic philosophy, which are, you know, pretty much products of the 20th century. And there's lots of these sort of extra bits and extra caveats, and like, okay, well, they weren't really thinking about this, so is that still philosophy? But it's like, in a way, what we're trying to do is try to retrofit. Okay, well, we have to make sure that we incorporate all the thinking that has existed for the last couple thousand years and say, and it all has to be consistent with the definition of philosophy. But the problem is the modern way we necessarily go about talking about these words has a new context in the time that we're using it. So, for example, most people who probably have some degree of experience with philosophy, they're going to have a different perspective of what philosophy is or how it should be defined compared to someone who perhaps is like a very specialized in studying the philosophy of like the pre-Socratics, for example, because their understanding of what philosophy would be, or like they would have to be incorporating it into what, say, like the pre-Socratics were doing. And what they were doing was very much like a proto-philosophy that had sort of, you know, some of the pieces of what we now recognize to be the broader context of what philosophy is. If that was just what we called philosophy, then it wouldn't be compatible at all with how we're thinking about it in the modern context. You're using, you know, talking about the institutions and things, like, sure, we can go, well, let's go look at what Plato's writing and say, well, he just laid the foundation, so what Plato was doing is philosophy. And then we can, but like, then what you're doing is you're going, well, does that mean that any later developments of philosophy are still philosophy?
I wouldn't say they're invalid, but I'd say that if you're having trouble pinning down something's essence, I think that gets harder and harder with time. And I think it's certainly useful to go back and see the inception and the genealogy of how the ideas develop. The essence carries through, because I mean, this is so the practice of philosophy obviously came from Socrates through to Plato and Aristotle, and then kind of got brought in through Christianity and Islam. And you can actually track that happening. You can see it, and the ideas remain relatively constant, and they inform the whole continental analytical split that we have now between philosophers. Even though, I mean, you could argue that's not really a legitimate split, but whatever. So if you're like a hardline analytic philosopher, and you have this kind of reductionist view of the world, or you're a romantic continental philosopher, I think there's some essence of Plato and stuff that's going to be the things that they started, the conversations they started. I think there's a genealogy, there's an essence to it. And I don't know if you can just, because I think what's happening now in the discipline is that people are getting a little bit cheesed off that certain people aren't being included in the discussion. Like I said, I'm tired of just talking about Nietzsche and Kant and stuff. Right. I want to. You
mean in terms of incorporating them with the label philosopher, or you know?
Yeah. So people are kind of. There's a book that came out recently. Ben sent me a link to it, and I sent him like a 3-page rant because I think it was a book by A.C. Grayling, and he kind of gives an overview of the Western tradition of philosophy. It's like a comprehensive history of philosophy, and he kind of presents it as having very little gaps. But he only gives like a chapter to Eastern thought and a chapter to African thought. And I think there are very good reasons for doing that. Because I think if you just go, oh, philosophy is this global conversation, I think you kind of miss the essence and the genealogy of certain arguments. I think you kind of, it's not really the same to say that, what Socrates was doing is essentially what Confucius was doing. I think they're very good people in those examples actually to compare, because they're both kind of like these non-religious figures. You could almost I think a lot of humanists have compared them both to Jesus, as they're kind of like the humanist Jesus. And it's like, yeah, I don't agree with that, but it's a very interesting idea to throw up. But I don't know, because there's this book called Witchcraft, which is from a new guy, and Ben sent me this. He's like, oh, check out this review of Witchcraft, because this review of Witchcraft.
To clarify, Ben is one of your old philosophy lecturers, right?
No. This is Ben, who's hopefully going to be on this podcast. Ben Ray.
It's Ben Ray. Okay, the young poet laureate for Herefordshire, Ben Ray, has been sending. Okay, just to clarify.
Should have clarified that. Yeah. He's going to come stay at my house on Monday.
That's great.
He's going to come in at 3 a.m. and wake me up.
Fucking hell.
Yeah, because he's been gallivanting around Europe. He sent me this thing, and it's basically a review of this book called Witchcraft, which is looking at all these kind of niche people that have never been considered before. I think one example was a shepherd who kind of made his way into the courts of Europe and was like having affairs with princesses and things. And it's like, well, that sounds very interesting, but there's probably a reason why he doesn't exist within the kind of pantheon of those great philosophers, why we don't study him. And that's not because philosophy is this like elitist thing. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I think you have to be careful of, we're not fetishizing the same 6 philosophers. We're not fetishizing the people. There's a reason why there's only 6 we focus on, or 6 or 7 or 8. It's because they represent a certain idea. We're not just like going, oh, these people are incredible, they're amazing.
Well, I think on top of that, you've got to remember that when we're talking about these things from a historical perspective, and I think I've mentioned this before, the pre-Socratics, like we're talking about a great degree of uncertainty about who these people really were. We're relying on all sorts of sources, some of them much more reliable, some of them not even primary sources to necessarily describe all these people. Often what we have are written works, and obviously the later things go, the more reliable and the more complete a lot of these sources are. But the genealogy of a lot of these ideas of these people aren't necessarily entirely just like novel thought that entirely came from these people. Many times you have these almost like movements of thought and context of thoughts that are coming up at the time, but it's sort of almost like the individuals that were sort of prime movers of these ideas that were really starting to write down a lot of stuff that become, if you like, associated with a lot of the thought. And I'm not saying obviously someone like Descartes, someone
absolutely,
Aristotle didn't have a novel thought. Of
course, right, that's the point I make.
There's a great degree of uncertainty, and I think that's partly when we do this idea of like picking out these people throughout history. There does have to be this slight acknowledgement that what we're doing here is like, if we were to try and to be totally historically accurate, one, we couldn't be because the reliability of things goes down and down. As to what we actually understood about these people, and who they actually were.
Yeah, I'm not. Just to clarify, so I'm not saying. I kind of want to say that. Descartes, is you mentioned, is a good example of this. So we associate him with this idea of the mind-body split and Cartesian dualism.
Right.
He just represents that idea.
Yeah.
No, philosophers are never saying, and people who study the history of philosophy are never saying, oh, Descartes is the first geezer to come up with this. He was the first person to think that your mind is separate from your body. Absolutely not. But he's just this kind of archetype for these ideas. And I think that goes for all of them. And I mean, yeah, these are interesting people, but so I agree with this guy who's doing this Whitcraft book. I agree. Well, I mean, to be fair, he wasn't the one bashing Grayling's book. It was the guy reviewing the two of them together. I don't know why he chose to like compare these two books. I don't know. The article kind of annoyed me a little bit because it's like apples and oranges. These are two different things. Like,
I think you sent me that article and I thought pretty much the same thing. I couldn't tell if this was a comparison or just two separate reviews that he was desperately trying to cram together.
Yeah, it was like
about two different things.
I think it was just really a review of Whitcraft. I don't think he was interested at all.
Yeah, I think he was obviously calling back to the A.C. Grayling book, because I think that was probably like, well, I've read this A.C. Grayling book and this is kind of similar, so I'm going to compare it to that. Yeah. Well, whatever. I don't want to slander this article without having barely read it. So.
Yeah, but I think that there are good reasons why we focus on the same 6 philosophers, but that's something for academia to do, and I think there are very good reasons why we do that. But then I agree with this guy in the sense that we need to move away from these guys. So I think we need to recognize what we're doing when we're talking about the big philosophers. That we're not just, because I saw that. Did you see that Steven Pinker article? Steven Pinker's like a kind of,
yes, he's a psychologist, linguist sort of thing, Canadian.
Yeah, and he dropped this little tweet the other day, and he was saying like, well, I don't know why we talk so much about Nietzsche because he was a misogynist. And I'm like, well, we don't talk about him because we think his views on women were great. That's missing the point.
Right. It's the same thing with like Heidegger or someone. It's like, well, just because he was a Nazi, does that mean that his ideas or what he thought can't have any kind of use or like insight into anything? Or
yeah, it's like when that goes to the whole ripping down statues in university campuses and things, which is, I think that's kind of blown over. But I think there was last summer or something, there was like a really big kind of moral panic about this, and people, mostly students. I think these articles were kind of overblowing the situation a little bit, but at the same time, it is kind of worrying. But I think it was like a couple of people had statues built of them, and these were like 200-year-old guys that I think they were slave owners, and it's like they were saying, well, we don't want statues of people that were slave owners because they're kind of immoral, and it's like, well, they were never really built because we thought these people were paragons of virtue and they would actually stand the test of time. I think probably a good attitude to harbor is that no one's morality will stand the test of time. That it's constantly in flux. We have to keep holding ourselves to the mark and keep like revising what we think is moral.
Well, in a word, it's historicism. It's the idea that current moral cultural values being applied to history in the context in which these people were, brought up in history is a valid way of judging their sort of moral character when it's just a totally different situation, different time, different context.
It's kind of like a weird form of virtue signaling that just it kind of breeds this weird complacency. It's like, how are you? It's like a cheat way to think of yourself as like a better person. It's like, I'm better than a slave owner for 200 years ago, and I'm going to prove it by smashing down a statue. It's like, well, yeah. If you knew what you knew now, he'd probably change his mind and agree with you. Like, it's way too anachronistic to kind of throw. It's like atheists who want to kind of say, oh, I'm smarter than everybody that lived in the Dark Ages. You're not, because I don't believe in sky fairies, and everybody who lived 1,000 years ago was an idiot. It's like, no, that's wrong. Think about that for a second. That cannot be true. So there's something in the way you're judging other people's views. It's just wrong. It's just not. It's not quite right. So people need a historically sensitive view of the big philosophers, but then I think we need to move away from the big philosophers. And this is why I wanted to get into podcasting, because I think that there's room to develop philosophy. I kind of want to stop even using the word philosophy. And I know that kind of rubs some people in academia up the wrong way.
I do totally agree, though.
Yeah, when they're sharing their papers and things, it's like, what is this for? Do you know how many papers are made and they never get read? It's like, for philosophy to become relevant again, because it is relevant.
Well, the people reading philosophy, at least when it comes to contemporary philosophy, are, it is these like people like Daniel Dennett and people like Sam Harris. I don't want to just name Four Horsemen people, but because I haven't really read that much contemporary philosophy, to be brutally honest. But it's like often when people are getting into this stuff, it's through people who are writing about it from a modern perspective or context. And, sure, like you could go, well, loads of these ideas aren't, it just harkens back to Aristotle and they're just regurgitating some, people from the 18th century. It's like, yes, but the point is that the reason why these people are important and, should be part of the discussion as much as anyone else is because the way and the context in which these ideas are brought to people is extremely important. But, to play devil's advocate to that, it is, it's both a bad thing and a...
Yeah, well, my lecturer was saying that he hates Jordan Peterson because he just regurgitates the 1920s. And I'm like, well, that's not a reason to hate him. You need to tell me what's wrong with the 1920s. Then I'll agree with you. And that, you might be wrong, you might be right. Sure.
He's like anyone else. He's got, he just takes inspiration from a lot of people, particularly people like Carl Jung and whatever. Yeah. And he has some of his ideas are fine. Some of his ideas I agree with. Some of them I don't. But it's just like, why is there this idea that you have to attach the wrongness to his character rather than to particularly what he's talking about? And why is novelty so important?
Yeah, animosity towards...
especially when we're talking, even when we talk about, like we've just mentioned, the great philosophers, when we go, oh yeah, Descartes, mind-body problem. Democritus, 1,000 years before Descartes, was already starting on that road with the separation of mind. But it's like, these
that's
ideas.
The thing. If you're just going to revere these six philosophers, and then anyone else who tries to regurgitate or I'd say not regurgitate, but apply their ideas in a modern setting and take those ideas further. If you're just going to attack those people, It's like, well, what do you want? Because even these 6 people weren't original. We just say they're original because it's easier to track their ideas.
Right. Although, I suppose, another aspect, there are original ideas in there, and there are, these people are held up for a reason. People like Kant, for example, had a lot of pretty, novel ideas, and he was, probably a good extreme example of someone just going like full on autismo on ethics.
Well, I can't understand. I mean, I kind of want to get into this idea of, I think it's all well and good us talking about philosophy in this context, but we can only do so much, and I don't think we're going to achieve anything really. But I'm always plagued by this wider problem, especially having grown up in an environment which, for some reason, just absolutely hated the idea of philosophy. Like, I'm not just talking about like family, but friends as well. He would just be like, "It's a waste of time. What are you? It's just thinking for the sake of thinking." I mean, it's not. Obviously, we know that, because obviously the people that say that are in effect in doing that, engaging in philosophy themselves, and also philosophy is just entwined in everything. It's the buzzword. It's this idea of, because I just sometimes say at work, like, "Oh, I do philosophy." I don't like talking about it, but if they ask, "Oh, why do you live here? Why have you?" I say, "Oh, I've been here for 5 years." "Oh, what have you been doing for 5 years?" "Oh, I've been studying philosophy." And then, it's kind of either two reactions where it's like, that sounds really hard. I could never do that. And it's like, I'm not. You're smarter than me. Trust me. I'm shit at this. I'm really not very good at philosophy at all. I just kind of fell into it, and it's the one thing that I really enjoy doing. It's really just circumstance that I've really attached myself to these ideas. And I think people just generally, they hear the word and they go, "Oh, that's that." They either say that's too hard, or "Oh, I don't know what that is. It sounds pointless."
Right.
And because the other reaction I get is kind of like, "What can you do with that? What does that get you?"
I'm sure somewhat of that mentality I would have probably had when I was much younger, at least like when it came, like before I started getting into philosophy. It's this idea that like, okay, you most of your experience to philosophy would be like, you go into RE or something at school. They go, if you found they use like teleological arguments and whatever from Aquinas.
If you found a watch in the desert.
And you're like, well, a lot of these arguments are, I mean, I'm not saying it's not important to go back to, Aquinas's various arguments for God.
It's useful to get students going, but that isn't philosophy. That's
right.
And actually the philosophy of religion is, I guess, what we're talking about there. So we're talking about proving God's existence or God's non-existence, and it's like, that's probably the most banal question happening in philosophy.
Right, but not only that, but it's not in the current modern context. A lot of those arguments are so sort of antiquated now.
Yeah, absolutely.
At least in terms of, because they've been responded to and been talked about and been argued over for a long, long time now, and it's like, what a lot of the more interesting and more cutting. I get it. There's a lot of complexity with a lot of the more contemporary philosophy, but it's at the same time, I think that being the modern exposure for most kids to philosophy isn't right. And I think the same thing with the Greek philosophers and things. It's like, okay, now I'm kind of interested in philosophy. I can sort of go back and appreciate much of that, but I still kind of look back at that, and I can see why 16-year-old me went, yeah, but they thought like everything was made out of 4 elements. Why should I care about like reading about? Because we just know that's not the case now.
Yeah,
and, and obviously there's a historical context to that, but that is a different interest to have about these philosophers. And there's history and there's philosophy, and there's the history of ideas in a sense, and all these things. And going back to the point about academics and sort of revering these philosophers, I think a lot of what happens is to know or have read some of the primary sources for a lot of these very standout philosophers is almost becomes this sort of seal of approval or badge of, I understand this concept or idea in ethics because I've and to a certain extent I think that's kind of true. I think if you've studied or like scrutinized the sort of origin or one of the primary sources of some of the people who brought a lot of these concepts and idea, it's almost like a sort of academic way of going, I can prove to you that I'm smart and that I know what I'm talking about. And to a certain extent that kind of makes sense, because it's easier to go, yes, I've read this and I understand this, and these antiquated philosophers blah blah blah, and I understand the history. But
how do you think we should teach people philosophy? What should be the entry point?
Right. So this is the $1 million question, isn't it? And this is what the problem is, because it's like, on one hand, we have these thinkers who sort of represent historically in the history of ideas and philosophy things that were very important and sort of, in a way, are important to put in a historical context and how these ideas influence things. And also studying them kind of gives you the proper genealogy and the proper foundation of what these ideas actually are. Whereas if you sort of sever the idea from the thinker, it doesn't always necessarily place it as well, I think, in philosophy. Which is
and that's where close reading comes in as well.
Right.
And a lot of those technical skills, which I think are useful to learn. But then I think, obviously you'll agree, there's the danger of just close reading Nietzsche all your life. It's
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of things, we've got this problem now where what we're sort of doing is we're going, well, hey, in order to understand anything about this particular idea in philosophy or this particular area of philosophy, we have to do this quite painful history lesson first and go through all this stuff and all this fluff, and like I said, the other people argue, well, you have to do that to properly understand the idea. But at the same time, what we're talking about here at the moment is more the educational aspect of it. The fact, we're getting people into philosophy, getting them interested.
And I think it goes broader than that. And I'd love to hear what Sam thinks. See, Sam's joined us for loads of podcasts. He's a teacher, which is surprising.
Believe it or not.
But it's this idea of, well, how do you get people interested in learning, essentially? Because I kind of wanted to rebrand this podcast a few times now, largely for reasons I've mentioned about this philosophy just being this buzzword that turns people off. But philosophy is also it's kind of the big example of this, because it's the one subject, I think, which is just done for its own sake. It's not the only subject, but I think it can be held up there as kind of a big shining example of, I don't know, I guess just like a subject that doesn't necessarily have utility. It's because I kind of wanted to combine ideas about history, culture, and just discuss ideas in general. Because I think, but I think philosophy is just up there as being on top of all of that stuff. And I think it always kind of has been, just by the very nature of what it is, because it's talking about disseminating between ideas and how do we decide which ideas have value and which ones don't. So, I don't know. I think maybe part of why people are turned off from it is because it's this big challenge. It's asking you to think for yourself.
Right. And I would say one of the big reasons, and I'm sort of getting to the sort of my ideas about why this is a problem and how we can start addressing this problem, is I think, honestly, it's relevance to modern context. And I think this is a problem that is sort of has spread through many areas of school subjects and whatever, where we have, especially in music, and I suppose the only thing I can probably talk about with authority is music tuition and that sort of thing, since that's my background. But especially in that, you have this problem where the examples that are being used and the way it's being taught is so removed from a modern context. And I get it. That's where like a lot of these that's the genealogy of the ideas. That's where it's like a lot of these ideas. You want to learn. Bart Corrals teach you a simple thing about about your chord patterns and your ones and your fives and your cadences, etc., and how to harmonize. But the problem is, you can do that with modern pop music. It's harder for the teacher because the teacher's going to have to go, oh well, hang on a minute, I did the same thing like 400 years ago when I went to university and I just learned this boring stuff in a textbook, and now I have to actually think and go through this pop song and write out the chords and talk about the cadences and that. But that is how you're going to get that relevant to the students, is by analysing the sort of modern context of where music is and incorporating something that's actually relevant to young people into the subject in order to get them interested. Then you can sneak in the history, you can sneak in the other stuff in the back door,
Right, you think it's a backdoor idea. Yeah, because I've always thought about it as, no, you spend just a while just throwing ideas at people and just saying, right, here's what's interesting. Isn't it interesting to learn? Then you can teach them anything. But I guess the backdoor thing works as well. The
example of that in philosophy would be something equivalent to having a modern context argument or something where you're making it relevant to the people. You're talking about an idea first, and you're talking about the not the history, not necessarily the genealogy, until later on. And it's like that sort of, and I understand sometimes maybe that's not always the best thing. Not everyone learns the same way. That's also the case. Some people do like to have this, have the person and the history and the context, and that helps them remember. And I totally understand that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think what's turning a lot of people off is the complete and utter removal from our modern environment and the things that are actually important to us. What a lot of people are thinking about a lot now.
See, this is difficult because I'm somebody who wants to go and get a PhD, and there are certain institutions that probably wouldn't like this conversation we're having right now. Someone like Zizek, who's a philosopher that's kind of funny. I still think like the average Joe wouldn't. You're just thinking of his lisp, aren't you?
I was interpreting funny in a slightly different, more offensive way. He's got a good sense of humour. He's
a bit of a lad, and I think he's quite an engaging, vibrant figure within philosophy. But the problem is, most people just hate him in the philosophical community, and I think he's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because most people on the street, even if you simplified one of Zizek's ideas, they'd be like, this isn't relevant to my life, I don't care. But I think part of that is because people aren't contemplative and introspective. They don't want to think, and I don't blame them. I don't want to do it. I've just been stuck doing it. But like, I don't want to sit thinking about the big questions all the time. I mean, I do, but I understand why it's hard, and people have pressing, real concerns at the moment. I think philosophy in that way is kind of a luxury, actually.
You can understand why it isn't necessarily something people are interested in. It's like, for us, it's an interest, right? It's something that we enjoy doing. We enjoy thinking about it.
I think it goes a bit further.
Not everyone has to enjoy these things,
I'm not sure. With philosophy, I think there is an importance to do it. I think that a society without philosophy, and by philosophy, I in this sense, I'm talking about just the ability to I mean, it sounds
critically analyze your thoughts or your beliefs. Yeah, it sounds patronising
because I'm basically saying people should think more. But I mean, I really do mean that, and I think philosophy is and I don't mean philosophy in a university. I don't mean academic philosophy, but I do mean philosophy in a more colloquial sense. I think that people should bring ideas to their life and discuss ideas like this. They don't have to podcast. They don't have to. Even have to read. But talking about ideas. What kind of person am I? What kind of person do I want to be? These very fundamental questions, I think, are just really important. But I get why the vast majority of people just don't want to do that. They got bills.
It's because it's uncomfortable to hold your beliefs up to the light and really scrutinise what you think. And
not only that, but I think they have bills to pay and stuff as well. It's like you're not going to be. I think in one sense it should bring philosophy to the fore even more when you're in a situation of struggle. But I still think you kind of need a baseline to be able to do that with. But yeah, it's that idea, isn't it? It's
I totally agree, and I think this, is relevant to sort of the other thing that we kind of wanted to discuss, which was this idea that there is a lot of, especially nowadays, there's a lot of this sort of split between philosophy and science, and this idea that they are in some sense incompatible with each other, or like are just like you have to be a scientist or a philosopher, or one is irrelevant and one isn't, and it's just like, and I totally think this is a problem with both philosophers and academic philosophers, as well as many scientists, and it is a problem that pervades both fields.
Yeah, so I used to run a humanist group, and I think I've mentioned this in a lot of podcasts, and I'm gonna be talking a lot more about that very soon. But there was this guy. You think you were there? When the guy said
the guy, the guy.
Yeah,
Could you give me a little bit more of a prompt as to what? Sorry, there was a guy. So when, where, how, who?
The guy that said the whole philosophy versus science thing. We should stage a debate about philosophy versus science. And my reply to him was, I genuinely don't know what you mean. It's like saying that
doesn't make sense.
Let's stage a textiles versus geology debate. So in what?
Well, it's even worse than that in a sense, because I would consider science, the scientific method, is a subset of a subset of philosophy.
Now, I said this in an essay once, and my lecturer was like, I'd be very careful about saying that. And I was never really convinced by the reasons he gave why you shouldn't call science a subset of philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like subset is probably in a way it's a bit aggressive, but it's kind of
it's
true.
an offshoot.
Because, well, if you think about it, it's like, so how, if you're going to do any degree of thinking about why the scientific method works and is good, you're doing epistemology. Like, you just fall into doing philosophy. You can't scrutinize the foundations of why you believe that logical empiricism works without doing philosophy. It's impossible. So it's like, in a way, it is the subset, because you end up doing philosophy if you're really going down to the basis of these ideas.
I think there is a problem with scientism, or like a very aggressive form of naturalism, which I saw a lot of in the humanist group. And I think this is what this guy kind of represented for me, where people believe in science as objective truth. And despite the language they use about evidence and kind of the ability to admit when you're wrong, to the reality you believe in, that's the crux of science, something I'd agree with, definitely. But I feel like language isn't quite enough, because I feel like, you can call a fork a spoon, but it's not. So I feel like a lot of these people were using I think Nietzsche actually says this. He says, how far are we in the podcast?
45 minutes.
45 minutes, and I've dropped Nietzsche in. But I think he basically says, a lot of these atheists that were rising around at the time he was writing, he kind of says, well, these guys kind of hide behind the language of objectivity, but in fact their views are quite zealous, and it doesn't really matter what they say. The attitude they have towards certain ideas is kind of dogmatic, and I think that you say that scientists are using philosophy. Most are, some aren't, I'd say.
Yeah, well, I think most are, in the sense that, well, if, like I said, you have to, if you start scrutinizing the foundations of what you're doing, then yes, you are doing philosophy in some sense. But
I mean, I probably came across as a bit too harsh then, because I mean, I'm more talking about people that like science but really don't know much about it. They're like armchair scientists. I don't think any real scientists have that opinion.
That's the problem. I think some do, and I think that's why this is, because I think both in academic philosophy we have this problem where there's such a sort of removal from this idea. Oh, I don't need to know about anything in science because I'm a philosopher and I'm beyond that, which I just think is this horribly arrogant idea that you don't need to enrich your understanding of the world.
I've seen a lot of that.
Yeah, but on the other side, yes, I think there are plenty. I know that Neil deGrasse Tyson, for an example of someone who's actually a big public speaker, he's a proper, I believe, astrophysicist or cosmologist.
He's got a good mustache as well.
Yeah, a fantastic mustache. But he has, I don't know if he's sort of dropped a bit of that now, but he did have a very sort of almost antagonistic attitude towards philosophy, or this idea that, science, and
did he?
What is this silly philosophy stuff? Yeah, and I think there are other, particularly with some of the scientists who are sort of the public speaky type, who bring maybe slightly sort of pop sciencey people.
Yeah.
But those are probably the people who are most important, at least when it comes to communicating this, that actually all these things are important and intertwined and unnecessary. And I think those are the people that should be most responsible, not for...
Yeah, I mean, I've never really seen it from people like Bill Nye or Brian Cox, but I mean, obviously Richard Dawkins is probably an example of what we're talking about. Although I've got a bit of a soft spot for Richard Dawkins, because I think he brought a lot to the conversation in terms of just really reminding the public since the Enlightenment what empiricism is, why we value evidence. I think the way he targeted religion was a complete misunderstanding of religion, and that the role of language in that conversation. I think he kind of misunderstood what he was doing there and bit off philosophically bit off a bit more than he could chew.
I think in many ways he was part of a movement, and I think that movement, so to speak, which in this context was New Atheism, was more of a reactionary, more of a sort of anti-religious movement, and a more of a sort of, in a way, sort of not particularly willing to sort of stop and try to attack necessarily the philosophical foundations of what they're doing.
I think it rose to prominence in the context at the time with the September 11 attacks and stuff. I think it was, and I think the Charlie Hebdo stuff after. I think that was the real context of New Atheism, and I think that's why it's died down now.
And I think the cultural zeitgeist has started shifting, and in a way, it's like the style of conversations we need to have now are not the same that we were having back then. But whether or not those conversations and those books like The God Delusion and God Isn't Great and all these sort of classic new atheism.
Yeah, well, I don't agree
books,
with the God Delusion. I don't like the God Delusion at all. But I think it's just this wonderfully relevant book at the time in terms of giving an idea, and it's like you have to have say if you're I don't really agree with political wings, but let's say you're left wing or you're a socialist. I think you have to be talking to conservatives, and even ultra conservatives. I think you need their voice present in the conversation, and I think it's like if you're talking about reforming society, you have to do things like referendums and polls, and you have to bring some of these voices that you might find ugly to the forefront. Yeah, I think like homophobes, with the whole gay marriage debate. I think their voices need to be out there so that you can
scrutinize them.
Yes, yeah, I don't have that critical a view of the God Delusion necessarily. I think his intentions were fine. If you think that religion is always a scientific proposition, which it never is really, unless you're a creationist or some kind of mental person. But it's never there to challenge science as an alternative to science. Really, I think he kind of made the language and the debates very regressive.
It's a bit of a straw man in a way.
And I think one of my other criticisms is that he gave us this idea of a debate as being something you win. But I think that was just a lot of anger and resentment at the time, and I think it was a voice that we needed.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It's like the cultural context is like, and this is part of the problem with, and you mentioned politics, and I think this pervades through politics as well, where you have a problem where if an issue wants to be addressed in the culture, what tends to get the biggest movement in terms of how to move the culture is the massive overreaction to, because that's how you get people into it and get people, and that's really unfortunate thing. But people only get sort of riled up and go, oh yeah, this needs to be changed if there's this massively exaggerated account of a particular thing. And I think that is the case with what happened with New Atheism, where it's like, yes, it made waves and it changed things, and there were many ways in which it helped to create a more secular environment in many ways, but at the same time, it's like, having analysed it in a modern context, like, yes, there were many problems with what was going on in terms of how much of an overreaction it might have been. But then again, is that a bit of historicism? Are we sort of going, well, back, and this is not very long ago, this is like 20, 30 years, but is the context at the time, was it necessary to have those kind of very loud, almost quite aggressive sort of anti-religious sort of things in order to get that message out and in order to get people riled up to make those cultural changes?
I really think it was. When you consider things like blasphemy laws, it's like, I think it's time he didn't do much for atheism. I think he set atheism as an idea, or atheists. I think he gave them a bad rap, really. I was watching, I think it was the Cleveland Show, do you know, animated?
It's a spin-off of Family Guy.
Yeah, spin-off of Family Guy.
I haven't seen it, but
it's all right. And it was late one night I was watching that, and one of the characters is like, I'm having a bit of a God crisis, and his dad says, "You're not an atheist, are you?" He goes, "Oh no. There was a guy who's an atheist came into school the other day, and he was horrible. No, I just don't know." And his dad goes, "Oh, well, that's normal. It's fine." I'm like, sorry, what was that? What was that shit about atheists? You just what is your idea of an atheist? Do you mean an anti-theist? Like, well, what's this? What's this kind of creeping into my animated? Like, I don't know. And I think maybe, I don't know what that was. It was just really strange. It's like they seem to have this picture. I mean, it's just an animated comedy or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. It's just this weird idea. An atheist is somebody who stands the flag in the ground and says, no, you're talking shit. It's
militant atheists.
Yeah, militant. Right. But I never really got the. It's funny. I was talking to one of the Lib Dem counsellors at like this posh hotel, because we were doing like a humanist event, and he came along. I was like, oh, we need this guy. He's like high profile kind of guy. We can sort of use him. And he's into his humanism and his atheism and stuff. And he came in, he was like, I hate religion, militant atheism. I'm a very militant atheist. He just kept saying he's a militant this and a militant that. I was like, how can you? And then two of us kind of went up to him and were like, how can you be a militant atheist? Isn't atheism just the negation of a thing, not really a thing in itself? So how can you be militantly not something? And it was like 5 seconds of staring blankly at each other, and he goes, it was a joke. I was like, okay. Was it? Sure.
That's some politics right there. You can tell he's a politician. Immediately 180s on that. Oh, it's a joke, guys.
Nah, he's a really funny guy. I think it might have been a joke, but I think there's some value in adopting this term of being a militant atheist, because I think it gives it a little bit of vibrancy and a little bit of. But I think Richard Dawkins did bad things for atheism on the whole. But yeah, he pushed the conversation forward, which is
right. Well, it's difficult to say. I think over time he became more and more like, oh, come on, just calm down now.
These people are deluded.
Yeah, I get annoyed with people who either say, oh, Dawkins is an idiot and I hate him and he's a terrible person. She's like, no, he was a brilliant biologist, to be pretty frank, and so it was, I think The Ancestor's Tale is still probably my favourite biology book, and he was contributed the ideas of the extended phenotype and things like this to evolutionary biology, which are really important and interesting ideas. It was kind of this sort of like I said, the sort of anti-theistic thing, which was perhaps and I think riled a lot of feathers, and I don't think necessarily, especially in the context now, that it is the right approach anymore. But
I think it was just wrong. I think his misgivings were misdirected. I think he had a straw man idea of religion. I think his contribution is probably more relevant than ever when it comes to things like alternative medicine and pseudoscience,
like homeopathy and things like this.
Yeah, because they actually do use the scientific method to push their claims. Flat Earth, the conspiracy theories, all these things. I think that's where...
Yeah, pseudoscience, that's... You can't really strawman that if you're attacking that with science, because the whole point is it's supposed to be like a science. So exactly, that's not a strawman at all.
Yeah, it's an entirely legitimate view. He's just using science to attack science that's wrong, intellectually. And I think, that's fine. But then he kind of lumps in religious claims with pseudoscience. And it's like, well, it's not pseudoscience, it's religion. It's its own separate thing. And if what you're saying is true, think about it. Religion would have been dislodged hundreds of years ago.
Right. Speaking of which, have you seen... So there's Richard Dawkins and Brett Weinstein do a sort of on-stage talk about this, literally this sort of thing. The idea of the extended phenotype. If you know what a phenotype is, the expression of a gene. So you have black hair, for example, that is the phenotype of your hair. That's how the genes have expressed themselves. What Dawkins sort of came up with is this idea that a phenotype doesn't necessarily have to stop at the physical features of the creature. If some manifestation of its behaviour is so essential to the genes of the organism that it is essentially a phenotypic part of the animal. And this is called the extended phenotype. So an example would be the dam of a beaver is so inseparable from the beaver because it's encoded in its genes for it to create this dam, and it can't really, they don't really exist without. And the same with termites and termite mounds. Like the termites always make a termite mound, or they don't, other than not being termites, they just don't work. So it's almost, so the termite mound is an expression of the genes as much as, say, like your hair color is an expression of the genes. And this is like this extended phenotype idea, as you can sort of, maybe start to get an idea for it as an extension to behavior, can also in some sense be reflected in human behavior and like some aspects to our cultural behaviors and our society and our social, like, exactly where the line of is this is a direct expression of our genes. Obviously that's an incredibly difficult and contentious area to talk about. What is an expression of our genes in terms of our behavior, what's environment and genes, etc., and that it can be all over the place. And I think a lot of the crux of this debate between Brett Weinstein and Richard Dawkins was this idea that, like, so what if religion is part of the extended phenotype, or is because religion always seems to be around and has survived for such a long time, and it's like, if you look at this from a purely evolutionary biological lens, it's like, why is this still around if it has no use?
And he doesn't have an answer for it, does he? He completely 180s.
He just goes, no, I stand by my mind virus thing. But it's like, well, he thinks it's like a virus, like as in it's like literally just something that developed and it's just stayed there for
which
no reason.
Which I think is such a provocative. I mean,
but it's strange.
He knows the rhetoric he's using. He knows that's provocative. He knows that's. I mean, there's an opening for a documentary he does. He's looking at the people at Lourdes are doing a pilgrimage, and it just opens with, "These people are deluded. They all believe in the same delusion, and they're wrong." It's just like it's literally that, almost word for word. And it's like, mate, what? How this isn't going to work? Like, who's this for? Is this for atheists? Then it's just an echo chamber,
right.
And that's going to have a negative effect because it's just going to make atheists more complacent and more angry. Is it for religious people?
Not only that, but it's not going to actually convert any religious people. And what you're trying to do with a lot of these things, and I think this is important, is you're not trying to change the minds of devout religious people. You're not trying to change the minds of the devout atheists, so to speak, or the militant atheists. What you're trying to do is those people who are sort of thinking about it and on the verge want to hear some good arguments or hear some like logical reasons for why your particular viewpoint might be the more realistic one. And I think that approach is just simply not the way to people who are open-minded or on the bench about these things are not going to be convinced if your argument is these people are deluded, and also this, and the same thing with like that debate where it's like, well, sure, you want maybe religion isn't part of the extended phenotype. Like, we're going out on a bit of a limb here, but it's like as a concept it could make sense. So what are your arguments against it being a potential manifestation of our genes in some sense? And if it is a potential manifestation of our genes, it must be sort of Darwinian in some sense. It must be an artifact that has actually survived for a reason. It must have some kind of use. And I'm not saying that it actually, a good argument against that. And I think it's a better argument to have if you're arguing against this idea of religion being an extended phenotype, is to go, well, but our modern context and our modern society is so different now. And the way in which social behaviours and the way societies arrange themselves are much more individualistic and much more and very different now. It's like, well, does our evolutionary history for most of our human development really apply anymore to these genes that are left? And that's probably a better and more reasoned argument. You can go down that line, but it's like instead he just goes, no, it's just a virus, and it's just something. It's just like a spandrel or something. A spandrel is like a thing in your genes that's kind of like necessary. He doesn't even argue that. He just literally says, well, no, it's just some bad thing that just happens to be there and survive for no reason. Which can happen. Like, we have all sorts of leftover sort of junk genes that aren't, are just sort of from our primordial lives. We still have like glands from fish and things that don't really have any purpose, or, and much of evolution is just this blind kind of appendix. And things like the appendix, which just gets infected, but it clearly hasn't been infected enough to stop enough people from, passing on genes, or there hasn't been enough of a mutation that gets rid of the appendix, and that hasn't had enough of an advantage at some point for the appendix to disappear in our.
Do you know why giraffes have those little horns?
No, why?
I didn't know. I was asking you.
No,
you seem like you're knowledgeable on giraffes.
No, I don't.
They got those little ear horns.
All right. Well, I mean, there's lots of reasons why random animals can have horns. I know male giraffes do fight and do contest each other. So perhaps, it is just another part of that. Perhaps it is like, it is that sort of evolutionary leftover thing where I'm sure the horns are literally, still around because males do fight and contest and things like this. So like any other species, you kind of got these little horns that help them headbutt people, which is, fine.